Hey, my friend, let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this question for a second. When was the last time you looked at your life and thought, this isn't what I planned? Maybe it was this morning. Maybe it was last night at 2 a.m. when you couldn't sleep and the silence was too loud. Maybe it was the moment you got the call, signed the papers, packed the boxes, or watched someone walk out the door for the last time. Wherever you are right now, I need you to know something before we go any further. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are not failing. You are in the middle of something that most people never have the courage to face. The complete unraveling of the life you thought you were going to have. And that takes more strength than most people will ever understand. But here's the thing, nobody tells you when your world falls apart. The hardest part isn't losing what you had. The hardest part is accepting that it's gone. The moment everything changed. Think about the version of yourself from 5 years ago, maybe 10. Picture that person, what they were wearing, where they were sitting, what they were dreaming about. What did they think their life was going to look like right now? Did they imagine the relationship they're no longer in, the career they no longer have, the city they no longer live in, the person they no longer are? There's a gap, sometimes a massive gut-wrenching gap, between the life you planned and the life you're actually living. And most people spend years, sometimes decades, standing in that gap, staring backward at what they lost instead of forward at what they could build. This is the trap, and almost everyone falls into it. It usually starts quietly. You tell yourself, you just need a little time. I'll be fine next week. Next month, things will be clearer. Once I figure out what happened, I'll be able to move on. But weeks turn into months. Months stretch into years. And somehow, you're still carrying the same weight, still replaying the same memories, still asking the same unanswerable questions. Why did this happen? What did I do wrong? What would my life look like if things had gone differently? And here's what nobody warns you about. The longer you stand in that gap, the more your mind starts to mistake the past for home. It starts to feel safer back there in the familiar ache of what used to be than it does moving forward into the terrifying uncertainty of what could be. But you cannot build a new life while you are still living in the ruins of the old one. And that is exactly where we need to start. What acceptance actually means. I want to address something right away because I know what some of you are thinking. Acceptance? That sounds like giving up. That sounds like saying what happened to me was okay. And it wasn't okay. You're right. Maybe it wasn't okay. Maybe what happened to you was unfair, painful, devastating, and completely outside of your control. Maybe someone hurt you. Maybe life threw something at you that you never deserved. Maybe the loss you experienced was real and profound and permanent. Acceptance doesn't mean any of that was fine. Acceptance means this. It happened, and now I have to decide what to do with the life I have left. That's it. That's the whole thing. Acceptance isn't a feeling. It's a decision. It's the decision to stop fighting a reality that already exists and to start directing your energy towards something that can actually change your future. Think about it like this. Imagine you're driving down a highway in Colorado, wide open sky, mountains on both sides, the kind of road that makes you feel like you could drive forever. Now imagine that somewhere behind you, about 30 miles back, there was a storm, maybe even an accident, something that shook you, that you had to pull over for, that took everything out of you just to get through. The storm is real. The accident is real. The pain of what happened back there is real. But the road in front of you, that's also real. And you cannot drive forward if your eyes are locked on the rearview mirror. This is what acceptance does. It doesn't erase what's behind you. It just frees you to look forward again. The invisible prison of the past. Let's talk about what actually happens in your brain when you can't accept that something is over. Psychologists call it rumination, the mental habit of replaying the same thoughts, memories, and scenarios over and over again. And it feels like you're being productive. It feels like if you just think about it enough, if you analyze it from every angle, eventually you'll find the answer that makes it make sense. But here's the cruel truth about rumination. It doesn't lead to resolution. It leads to re-injury. Every time you replay that conversation in your head, you're not processing it. You're reliving it. Every time you imagine how things could have been different, you're not healing. You're reopening a wound that was just starting to close. Every time you check their social media, read the old texts, drive past the old apartment, you are choosing, unconsciously, but choosing to stay in pain. And I want to be gentle here because I know this isn't intentional. Nobody wants to suffer. Nobody wakes up and thinks, you know what? I'm going to spend today torturing myself with things I can't change. It happens because the brain is wired for pattern completion. When something ends abruptly, without closure, without a neat explanation, the mind goes back to try to finish what feels unfinished. It's a survival mechanism. It's just working against you. There was a woman, let's call her Sarah, who spent 3 years after her divorce unable to fully move forward. Not because she wanted to be married to her ex-husband, not because she even missed him, really, but because she couldn't stop trying to understand how someone she trusted so deeply could have done what he did. She kept replaying their last year together, looking for the signs she missed, the moment it went wrong, the version of events that would finally make it make sense. 3 years. And she told me later, I didn't lose just the marriage. I lost 3 years of my actual life trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. The moment that changed things for her wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when she was sitting in her kitchen in Portland, coffee going cold on the counter, and she had a thought so simple it almost made her laugh. I'm never going to understand this completely. And that's okay. I don't need to understand it to move on from it. That was her moment of acceptance. Not dramatic, not tearful, just quiet and clear and true. And from that Tuesday forward, everything started to shift. The identity crisis nobody talks about. Here's something that makes acceptance even harder, and I don't think we talk about it nearly enough. When the life you built falls apart, it's not just the circumstances that change. Your identity changes. And that is terrifying in a way that's almost impossible to articulate. Think about how we introduce ourselves. Think about how we answer the question. So, who are you? We don't usually say, I'm a person with hopes and fears and a complicated inner life. We say, I'm a teacher, I'm a husband, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a mom, I live in Austin. I've been with my partner for 8 years. We define ourselves through our roles, our relationships, our circumstances, our locations. And when those things change, when the relationship ends, when the career collapses, when the city we called home becomes somewhere we used to live, we don't just lose the thing itself. We lose the version of ourselves that was built around it. This is what makes moving on feel like a kind of death. Because in a real way, it is. The person you were in that life doesn't exist anymore. And grieving that person, the one you were before everything changed, is not weakness. It's completely human. But here's what I need you to hear. That version of you was not your final form. Every single person who has ever rebuilt their life from the ground up has had to let go of a previous version of themselves. Every person who has ever started over has had to mourn who they used to be before they could discover who they were becoming. The question isn't whether you're willing to change. The question is whether you're willing to let go of who you were in order to become who you could be. And that answer, only you can give it. Why we hold on so tightly, let's be honest for a minute about why letting go is so incredibly difficult. Part of it is grief. Pure, raw, legitimate grief. When you lose something that mattered, a relationship, a dream, a version of your life, you are supposed to grieve that. Grief is not a flaw. Grief is love with nowhere to go. And rushing through it doesn't work. You have to move through it, not around it. But part of why we hold on goes deeper than grief. It goes into something that psychologist Bessel van der Kolk describes as the body's deep reluctance to relinquish a familiar state, even when that state is painful. In other words, we cling to suffering we know over healing we don't. There's a certain comfort in familiar pain. At least you know what it is. At least you know how to survive it. The unknown, the territory of starting over, of becoming someone new, of building something from scratch, that's terrifying in a completely different way. Because it means possibility, and possibility means you could fail again. And after everything you've already been through, the thought of failing again can feel unbearable. So you stay, emotionally, even when you've physically moved on, even when everyone around you thinks you're fine, even when you're smiling and going to work and functioning. Somewhere inside, you're still standing in that old life, holding a door open for a version of yourself that isn't coming back. I want you to hear this with as much gentleness as I can offer. It's okay that you held on. It made sense that you held on. But it's time to let the door close. The space that opens when you let go. Here's something beautiful that happens on the other side of acceptance, something that nobody tells you because it's hard to describe until you've lived it. When you finally, genuinely accept that the old life is over, not in a defeated way, but in a clear-eyed, courageous way, something opens up inside you. There's this phrase in mindfulness circles, beginner's mind. It comes from Zen Buddhism, and it describes the quality of approaching something with openness and curiosity, without the filters of past experience. When we hold on to the past, we experience the present through the lens of what we've already lost. But when we accept that the past is past, we start to see the present and the future with fresh eyes. Space opens up. Mental space, emotional space, creative space, energy that you were spending on grief, on analysis, on maintaining the fiction that things could go back to the way they were. That energy becomes available for something else, for building, for dreaming, for becoming. Think about a garden. If you've ever tried to plant anything new in soil that's already packed full, you know that the first thing you have to do is clear the space. Pull up what was there before. Prepare the ground. That process can feel destructive. You're tearing things out, turning the earth, disturbing what was settled. But without that clearing, nothing new can take root. Your life is that garden, and acceptance is the act of clearing the ground. The practical side of acceptance. Okay, so we've talked about what acceptance means and why it matters. Now let's talk about how you actually get there. Because saying just accept it is about as useful as telling someone to just be happy. What does it actually look like in practice? Step 1. Name what's actually over. This sounds simple. It is not simple. Most of us have a vague, floating sense that things have changed, but we haven't actually named specifically what we're grieving. So get specific. Write it down if you need to. What exactly is the chapter of your life that has ended? Not in a dramatic way, just factually. The marriage is over. The startup failed. The friendship ended. That version of my career is gone. The life I thought I was going to have doesn't exist. Name it. Clearly. Out loud if you can. There's neurological research showing that the act of labeling emotions and experiences, what scientists call affect labeling, actually reduces the intensity of the emotional response. Putting words to pain doesn't make it worse. It makes it manageable. Step 2. Separate what you're grieving from what you're actually missing. These are not always the same thing. Sometimes we grieve a relationship not because the relationship was good, but because we miss the feeling of belonging it gave us. Sometimes we grieve a career not because we loved the work, but because we miss the sense of identity it provided. Sometimes we grieve a city or a phase of life not because we want it back, but because it represented a version of ourselves we're not sure how to carry forward. Getting clear on this distinction is powerful, because often what you're actually missing, belonging, identity, purpose, connection, is something you can find again in a new form, in a new context, but not if you're convinced that it can only exist in the past. Step 3. Practice returning to the present. Every time your mind starts to drift back to the should-haves and the could-haves and the what-ifs, gently bring it back. Not with frustration, not with self-criticism, just a quiet, firm redirect. That was then. This is now. What do I have in front of me right now? This is a practice. It doesn't happen perfectly the first time or the 10th time, but every time you do it, every time you consciously redirect your attention from what was to what is, you are strengthening a new neural pathway. You are literally training your brain to live in the present instead of the past. Step 4. Allow grief without judgment. Here's a paradox that catches a lot of people. Sometimes the reason we can't fully accept something is because we won't let ourselves fully grieve it. We think that crying about it means we're not over it. We think that missing something means we made the wrong choice. We think that feeling sad means we're weak or stuck or broken. But grief and acceptance are not opposites. Grief is often part of acceptance. You can cry for what's lost and still choose to move forward. You can miss something deeply and still know that going back isn't the answer. You can honor what was without letting it be the only thing that is. Give yourself permission to feel it, all of it, and then, gradually, in your own time, give yourself permission to turn the page. A letter to your old life. I want to try something with you. I want you to imagine, just for a moment, that you could write a letter to your old life, to that chapter that's ended, to the version of yourself that existed before everything changed. What would you say? Maybe you'd say, "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." Maybe you'd say, "You were more beautiful than I realized at the time." Maybe you'd say, "I don't understand why you had to end. I'm still angry about it." Maybe you'd say, "Thank you for teaching me what you taught me. I'm ready now." Whatever it is, whatever is true for you, that letter is worth writing. Not to send anywhere, just to externalize what you're carrying, to move it from the inside out, to acknowledge what was with honesty and with compassion before you say goodbye to it. Because here's the thing. Acceptance isn't about pretending the old life didn't matter. It's about honoring it enough to let it go. The people who are most able to rebuild after loss are not the ones who harden themselves against pain or convince themselves that what they lost wasn't important. They're the ones who grieve fully, honor honestly, and then, with tremendous courage, choose to turn toward what comes next. You are more than what you've lost. I want to end this first part by saying something to you directly, from one human being to another. You are not the sum of what you've lost. You are not defined by the relationship that ended, the career that collapsed, the dream that didn't happen, or the life that didn't go according to plan. Those things happen to you, but they are not you. You are something that cannot be taken by circumstance. You are your capacity to feel deeply, even when what you feel is pain. You are your courage to keep reading something like this, even when part of you wants to give up. You are your curiosity about who you might become. You are your stubbornness in the face of a life that has not been kind to you. And you are at the beginning of something, not the end. The beginning. The old chapter is closed. That's real. That's painful. That's true. But the next chapter? It hasn't been written yet. And that blank page, is not something to fear. It is something to claim. There's a question that lives inside every painful experience. You don't choose to ask it. It just appears, sometimes quietly, sometimes like a scream in the aftermath of everything falling apart. Why me? Why did this happen to me? Why did I lose this? Why did they leave? Why did it fail? Why, out of everyone, did life choose me for this particular brand of suffering? And I need to tell you something about that question before we go any further. It is one of the most natural, most human questions you could possibly ask. There is nothing wrong with you for asking it. Every single person who has ever faced real loss, real failure, real heartbreak, every one of them has stood in that same place, asking that same question into the dark. But here is what nobody told you when you started asking it. Why me is a question that was never designed to have an answer. And the longer you keep asking it, the longer you stay trapped. The anatomy of why me? Let's look at what actually happens when that question takes hold of your mind. The moment something painful happens, a job loss, a breakup, a betrayal, a failure, your brain does something completely automatic. It goes into search mode. It starts scanning for a reason. Because the human brain is a pattern recognition machine, and it cannot tolerate randomness. It needs things to make sense. It needs a narrative. It needs to understand why, so it can protect you from the same thing happening again. This is not a character flaw. This is evolution. Your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is that life doesn't always cooperate with our need for clean explanations. Sometimes relationships end not because anyone was purely at fault, but because two people grew in different directions. Sometimes careers collapse not because you did anything wrong, but because an entire industry shifted beneath your feet. Sometimes friendships dissolve not because of a single betrayal, but because people change and drift and the connection quietly loses its thread. Sometimes things just happen, and there is no satisfying answer to why. But your brain doesn't know how to accept that. So it keeps searching, and in the absence of a real answer, it starts generating its own. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm fundamentally unlovable. Maybe I'm cursed. Maybe I just don't deserve good things. And this is where why me becomes genuinely dangerous. Because when you can't find an external reason, your mind turns inward, and it starts to assign blame to the most available target. You, the victim, mindset, and why it's not your fault that you're in it, when why me becomes your default response to hardship. Something subtle but profound happens to the way you see the world. You start to feel like things happen to you rather than for you, or even just around you. You start to feel like you're a passive character in your own story, someone being acted upon by forces beyond your control, someone at the mercy of a universe that has it out for you specifically. Psychologists call this an external locus of control, the belief that your outcomes are primarily determined by external forces, luck, other people, circumstances, fate. And research consistently shows that people with a strong external locus of control struggle more with resilience, motivation, and emotional well-being. But here's what I want you to understand. Falling into a victim mindset after genuine loss is not weakness. It is not a personality defect. It is a completely predictable response to pain. When you've been hurt, really hurt, your nervous system goes into protection mode. And part of that protection is creating a story that explains the hurt. A story in which you were powerless, in which someone or something else is responsible, in which you couldn't have done anything differently. That story protects you in the short term. But it also imprisons you. Because as long as the story is that you are powerless, as long as why me is your frame, you cannot take the actions that would actually change your life. You're waiting for the external world to change. You're waiting for someone to apologize, for circumstances to improve, for luck to turn. And sometimes those things happen, but often they don't. And while you're waiting, your life is passing. There was a guy, let's call him Marcus, who lost his business in 2019, a restaurant he'd spent 6 years building that his whole identity was wrapped up in, that he genuinely believed in. It closed because of a combination of factors: a difficult landlord, a changing neighborhood, some decisions he made under pressure, some that were just bad timing. For almost 2 years after it closed, Marcus was stuck in why me. He blamed the landlord. He blamed the economy. He blamed his business partner. He blamed himself. He cycled through all of it over and over, trying to find the answer that would explain how something he had worked so hard for could just be gone. 2 years, and the restaurant was still closed, and Marcus was still stuck. And the only person whose life was actually being affected by all of that energy was Marcus. The landlord wasn't thinking about it. The economy didn't care. The business partner had moved on. Only Marcus was still standing in the wreckage, demanding that it explain itself. The shift that changes everything. Now, here's where it gets interesting. One afternoon, Marcus was talking to his older brother, a guy who'd been through his own share of loss and had come out the other side. And his brother said something that Marcus told me later felt almost too simple to be profound. Man, stop asking why it happened. Start asking what you're going to do now. That's it. That's the whole shift. From why me to what now. 5 letters versus 8. But the distance between those two questions is the distance between a life that is stuck and a life that is moving. Why me? Looks backward. It lives in the past. It is obsessed with causation, with blame, with understanding, and it cannot be satisfied because the past cannot be changed. What now? Looks forward. It lives in the present. It is focused on agency, on possibility, on the next step. And it can be satisfied because the future can always be shaped. The moment Marcus started asking, what now, instead of why me, something cracked open, not immediately, not dramatically, but the energy that had been locked up in analysis and blame started to become available for something else. He started thinking about what he'd learned, about what he'd do differently, about what parts of his dream were still alive, even if the original form of it was gone. He started thinking about the skills he'd built, the relationships he'd made, the things about running a business that he actually loved, separate from the specific business that had failed. Within 18 months, Marcus had opened a smaller place, different concept, different neighborhood, different partnership structure, and it was doing well, not because everything was magically easier, but because Marcus was a different person walking into it. A person who'd stopped asking why things went wrong and started asking what to do next. What now actually does to your brain. This isn't just philosophy. There's real neuroscience behind why this question works. When you ask, why me? You activate the parts of your brain associated with threat detection and emotional pain processing. Primarily the amygdala, which is your brain's alarm system. The amygdala doesn't distinguish between physical danger and emotional pain. It treats both as threats, and when it's activated, it triggers your stress response. Cortisol floods your system, your thinking narrows, your options seem limited. This is why being stuck in why me feels so exhausting. You're literally running your brain's stress system continuously. You're in a state of perpetual threat response. And in that state, creative thinking, problem solving, and forward planning are genuinely impaired. Now ask, what now? And watch what shifts. What now is a solution-focused question. And solution-focused thinking activates your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning, creativity, and executive function. It calms the amygdala. It reduces the cortisol load. It opens up your thinking rather than narrowing it. You literally think better. You see more options. You feel more capable just from changing the question. This is not wishful thinking. This is how your brain actually works. And understanding it gives you something powerful. The knowledge that you have more control over your mental state than you might realize. Not by suppressing pain or forcing positivity, but by choosing, consciously and repeatedly, where you direct your attention. The practice of redirecting. Okay, so how do you actually make this shift in real life? Because knowing that "what now?" is a better question doesn't automatically make it easy to ask. Here's the truth. In the beginning, it won't feel natural. Your brain has been practicing "why me?" maybe for years. You've worn grooves into that neural pathway. When something hard happens, that's where your mind goes automatically, the way water follows the path of least resistance. Redirecting doesn't mean fighting that impulse. It means noticing it, acknowledging it, and then gently, firmly, choosing a different direction. Here's a simple practice that works: the pause and redirect. When you notice your mind going into "why me?", when you feel the spiral starting, when the blame and the questioning and the self-pity start pulling you down, pause, just for a moment, take a breath, and then ask yourself out loud if possible, okay, so what now? Not in a harsh, self-critical way, not in a way that dismisses the pain, just as a genuine, curious, forward-focused question. Given that this is my situation, what is the most useful thing I can do right now? The answer doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes the answer is, I can take a walk, I can call a friend, I can write down 3 things that are still in my control. I can eat something decent and get some sleep. Small, forward-focused actions. That's all it takes to start. Because here's what happens when you start consistently redirecting toward "what now?" You begin to rebuild something that pain erodes. A sense of agency. The feeling that you are not just a passive receiver of whatever life throws at you, but an active participant in shaping your own story. And that feeling, that small, quiet sense of "I have some power here," is the foundation of everything that comes next. The trap of toxic positivity. I want to pause here and say something important because I think this concept can get misunderstood in a way that actually causes harm. Shifting from "why me?" to "what now?" does not mean pretending everything is fine. It does not mean slapping a smile on top of genuine pain and telling yourself to just think positive. It does not mean rushing your grief or skipping the hard feelings or performing resilience for the benefit of people around you. That's not what this is. That's toxic positivity. And toxic positivity is not helpful. It's just pain with a cheerful soundtrack. Real resilience looks different. Real resilience says, "This hurts. This is genuinely hard. I am allowed to feel this." And then, not instead, but after, or even alongside, it also asks, "What can I do with this? Where do I go from here?" You can grieve and still take the next step. You can be sad and still move forward. You can acknowledge that something was deeply unfair and still refuse to let that unfairness define the rest of your life. The emotions are not the enemy. The emotions are information. They tell you what mattered to you, what you've lost, what you value, what you need. Feel them. Respect them. Let them move through you. Just don't let them become your permanent address. What now looks like in real life? Let me walk you through some real scenarios The kind of losses and setbacks that people actually face, and show you what the shift from why me to what now looks like in practice. Scenario 1, the job loss. You've been laid off. You worked hard, you were good at what you did, and it didn't matter because it was restructuring or budget cuts or some decision made 3 levels above you that you had no input into. Why me? Sounds like I should have worked harder. I should have networked more. Maybe I'm just not talented enough. Why does this always happen to me? Is this ever going to get better? What now? Sounds like, what do I actually need right now? What are my immediate priorities, financially, emotionally, practically? What did I learn in that job that I can take with me? What do I want the next chapter of my career to look like? Who can I reach out to? What's my first step? Same situation, completely different mental posture, and a completely different outcome over time. Scenario 2, the ended relationship. A relationship you believed in, maybe even built your future around, has ended. Maybe it ended because of something they did. Maybe because of something you did. Maybe because of the slow, grinding incompatibility that only becomes visible over years. Why me? Sounds like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I make love work? Why does everyone leave? Was any of it real? How could they do this? What now? Sounds like, what do I actually need to heal? What did this relationship teach me about what I want and what I won't accept? What do I need to work on in myself? Who do I want to become? Separate from this relationship? What does a good life look like for me right now, as I am? Scenario 3, the dream that failed. You had a vision, a business, a creative project, a goal you worked toward for years, and it didn't happen. Not because you didn't try. You did, but it didn't work out. Why me? Sounds like, was I ever good enough to do this? Maybe I was deluding myself. What was the point of all that effort? Why do other people get to succeed and I don't? What now? Sounds like, what did I build through this process in terms of skills, knowledge, character? What did I learn about what works and what doesn't? What part of this dream is still worth pursuing? What would I do differently? What's the next version of this? Smaller, smarter, more sustainable? In every single case, the question you lead with shapes the path you walk. The deeper gift of what now? Here's something that might surprise you. The shift from why me to what now doesn't just change how you respond to problems. Over time, it changes who you are. When you practice forward-focused thinking consistently, when you train yourself to ask what's next instead of what went wrong, you develop what psychologists call self-efficacy. It's the deep, experiential belief that you are capable of influencing your own outcomes, that your actions matter, that you are not simply at the mercy of circumstance. Self-efficacy is not the same as confidence. Confidence can be superficial. It can exist without evidence, and it can shatter when things go wrong. Self-efficacy is built from evidence. It grows every time you face something hard and find a way through. Every time you choose what now over why me, and discover that you actually can figure out the next step, you're adding to a growing body of proof that you are capable. And once you have enough of that proof, something remarkable happens. You stop being afraid of hardship in the same way, not because life gets easier, not because you become invulnerable to pain, but because you've shown yourself through direct experience that when things fall apart, you can find your way. You've been in the wreckage before, and you've found the way out. So the next time the wreckage comes, there's something steady underneath the fear, a quiet, earned knowing. I've been here before, I found a way through, I'll find one again. That's what now builds, not just a response to a single crisis, but a way of being in the world that makes you fundamentally more resilient. When you fall back into why me, I want to be honest with you about something. You will fall back. Even after you've genuinely made this shift, even after you've practiced it and experienced the difference and built some real momentum, there will be moments when the old pattern returns. When something triggers you, when a new loss lands, when you're exhausted and depleted and your defenses are low, why me? We'll be right there, waiting. This is normal. This is human. This is not failure. The goal is not to permanently eliminate why me from your consciousness. The goal is to shorten the time you spend there, to notice sooner, to redirect faster, to spend less of your precious life energy in the backward-looking spiral and more of it in the forward-looking question. Progress is not linear, but it is real. And every time you catch yourself in why me and consciously redirect, even if it takes you 3 days instead of 3 weeks this time, that is growth. That is the work. That is you becoming someone who handles life differently. Be patient with yourself. Be honest with yourself. And keep asking a question. What now? A challenge for you. Before we move to the next part of this journey, I want to offer you something concrete. Think of one situation in your life right now. One thing that hasn't gone the way you planned. One loss or setback or disappointment that you've been carrying, and spend 5 minutes with it. First, allow yourself to acknowledge the why. Me? Fully. Don't suppress it. Let it speak. Write it down if it helps. All the questions, all the frustration, all the unfairness, let it out. Then shift. Ask yourself as honestly and as gently as you can. Given that this is my reality, what now? What is one small thing I can do, think, or choose differently today? You don't have to have a 5-year plan. You don't have to have everything figured out. You just need one step, one small forward-facing answer. That's where rebuilding begins, not in the grand plan, not in the perfect strategy. In the moment, you stop asking why things went wrong and start asking what you're going to do next. That's the turning point, and it's available to you right now, in this moment, wherever you are, whatever you've been through. What now? There's a conversation most of us have had, or desperately needed to have, that we keep putting off. Not with a boss, not with a doctor, not with a financial advisor, with ourselves. And the question at the center of that conversation is one that feels almost too uncomfortable to ask out loud. Are the people around me helping me grow, or are they keeping me stuck? That question has the power to change everything, and yet most of us spend years, sometimes our entire lives, avoiding it. Because the answer often points toward something that feels deeply threatening. The possibility that some of the relationships we've built our lives around may no longer be serving us. Maybe even that some of them never did. And choosing yourself, choosing your growth, your peace, your future, over the comfort of familiar connection, that is one of the hardest things a human being can do, but it might also be the most necessary. the energy economy of your life. Let's start with something that sounds almost too practical for a conversation about relationships and growth. You have a finite amount of energy every single day, not just physical energy, though that too, but mental energy, emotional energy, creative energy, the capacity to think clearly, to feel deeply without being overwhelmed, to make good decisions, to show up for the things and people that genuinely matter to you. This energy is not unlimited. It is a resource. And like any resource, the question is not just how much you have, but how you spend it. Think about a typical week in your life. Where does your energy actually go? Some of it goes to necessary things: work, parenting, managing the logistics of being alive. That's unavoidable. But a significant portion of most people's emotional and mental energy goes somewhere else entirely. It goes to managing difficult relationships, to processing drama that other people create, to recovering from conversations that leave you feeling worse than before they happened, to the low-grade anxiety of being around people who make you feel small or judged, or like you have to perform a version of yourself that isn't really you. That energy cost is real, and most of us have never actually sat down to calculate it. Here's a simple question worth sitting with. After you spend time with someone in your life, a friend, a family member, a coworker, do you generally feel energized or drained? Not every interaction with every person will be perfect. Not every conversation will leave you feeling on top of the world. But as a consistent pattern, as the baseline of how a relationship makes you feel, energy is one of the most honest signals you have. People who add to your energy are worth protecting. People who consistently drain it, regardless of history, regardless of obligation, regardless of love, may be costing you more than you realize. The people who keep you small. Let me describe someone you might recognize. They've known you for a long time. Maybe they're a childhood friend, a sibling, a colleague you've grown close to over years. They care about you in their way. You care about them, but every time you share something you're excited about, a new goal, a change you're making, a direction you're heading, something happens. Not always overtly, not always with words, but there's a reaction, a slight deflation, a comment that sounds supportive but lands differently. That sounds risky. Are you sure? You've tried things like that before? Don't you think you're being a bit unrealistic? Or maybe it's more subtle. Maybe they just go quiet. Change the subject. Don't ask follow-up questions. Treat your enthusiasm like something slightly embarrassing that they're politely pretending not to notice. And over time, slowly, almost imperceptibly, you start to edit yourself around them. You stop sharing the big dreams. You keep the ambitious plans to yourself. You show them only the version of you that fits comfortably within the container of who they've always known you to be. This is what it looks like when someone keeps you small. Not through malice, almost never through malice, but through their own limitations, their own fears, their own unconscious investment in you staying exactly where you are. Because if you change, if you grow, if you become something different than what they know, that threatens the equilibrium of the relationship. And for some people, that threat is too uncomfortable to tolerate. The tragedy is that these relationships often come wrapped in genuine affection. These aren't villains. They're people who love you in the only way they currently know how, which happens to be a way that requires you to stay the same. And you'll have to make a decision about what to do with that. What detachment actually means. When I talk about detaching from people who are holding you back, I want to be very precise about what I mean, because this concept gets distorted in ways that can actually cause harm. Detachment does not mean deciding that people who haven't supported your growth are bad people, cutting everyone off dramatically and burning relationships to the ground, becoming cold, isolated, or emotionally unavailable, abandoning people who genuinely need you, using protecting my energy as an excuse to avoid any relationship that requires effort. Real detachment, healthy, growth-oriented detachment, means something much quieter and more intentional than any of that. It means creating emotional distance where proximity isn't serving either of you. It means recognizing that a relationship can have genuine history and genuine affection and still not be the right relationship for this chapter of your life. It means making conscious, thoughtful choices about where you invest your time, attention, and emotional energy, based not just on obligation or habit, but on where that investment actually takes you. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it means letting certain relationships naturally recede, not ending them with a speech or a confrontation or a dramatic declaration, just allowing them to find their natural level, seeing each other less, being less emotionally available, creating the space you need to grow into the person you're becoming. The guilt that comes with choosing yourself. Let's talk about the feeling that stops most people from ever making this choice. Guilt. The moment you start to pull back from a draining relationship, the moment you decline the invitation, don't return the call. Choose to spend that Saturday doing something for yourself instead of showing up for someone who consistently takes more than they give. The guilt arrives. Who do I think I am? That person has been in my life for 15 years. They need me. What kind of person prioritizes their own growth over their relationships? This is selfish. I want to address that last one specifically because it's the one that does the most damage. Choosing yourself is not selfish. Let me say that again, because I know it's going to land differently for different people, and some of you have been told your whole lives that putting your own needs first is a character flaw. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It is the foundation of everything else. Here's the truth about selfishness. It's not defined by whether you prioritize yourself. It's defined by whether you do so at a genuine cost to others who are genuinely depending on you. Taking care of your mental health, protecting your emotional energy, investing in your growth, creating distance from relationships that are damaging you. None of these things are selfish. They are self-preserving. And self-preservation is not a luxury. It is a prerequisite. You cannot show up fully for the people who actually matter to you if you are running on empty. You cannot contribute meaningfully to the world if you've given everything you have to relationships that take without giving back. You cannot become the person you need to become if you're spending all your energy maintaining connections that require you to stay small. The most loving thing you can do for yourself and ultimately for the people around you is to protect the energy that makes you capable of loving at all. the science of social contagion. Here's something that might make you uncomfortable. You are more influenced by the people around you than you think. Not just in the obvious ways, the advice they give, the opportunities they introduce you to, the direct encouragement or discouragement they offer, but at a much deeper, more automatic level. Social scientists have a term for this: social contagion. The idea that behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and even emotional states spread through social networks the way viruses spread through populations, not through conscious decision, but through proximity and exposure. Groundbreaking research by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler found that everything from happiness to obesity to smoking habits spreads through social networks up to 3 degrees of separation, meaning that the behaviors and emotional states of your friends can influence you, even without your awareness. Think about what this means for the people you spend the most time with. If you're surrounded by people who complain constantly, who see problems everywhere, who have given up on their own potential and made peace with mediocrity, that worldview seeps into you, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, the way water shapes stone. Their ceiling becomes your ceiling. Their limitations start to feel like your limitations. Conversely, and this is the hopeful part, if you're around people who are growing, who are ambitious without being ruthless, who take their development seriously and encourage you to do the same, that seeps in too. Their belief in possibility starts to feel possible to you. Their energy raises yours. Their example shows you what you're capable of. You become, over time, an average of the people you're closest to. So the question isn't just who you enjoy spending time with. The question is, who do you want to become? And are the people around you helping you get there? The different types of draining relationships. Not all energy-draining relationships look the same. Let me break down a few of the most common patterns, because recognizing them is the first step to making conscious choices about them. The crisis magnet. This person is always in the middle of something. There is always a drama, always an emergency, always a situation that requires your immediate emotional attention. And when you show up, as you do, because you care, you pour your energy into helping them navigate whatever is happening right now. The problem is that the crisis never fully resolves, because the crisis isn't really about the circumstances. It's about the person's relationship with stability and self-sufficiency. They generate chaos unconsciously, because chaos is what's familiar to them, because chaos keeps people close, because calm would require them to sit with themselves in a way they're not equipped to do. You can have compassion for this without being consumed by it. The chronic pessimist. Everything is terrible. Every silver lining has a cloud behind it. Every good thing is temporary and probably suspicious. Every attempt at optimism is met with a list of reasons why it won't work out. Spending extended time with a chronic pessimist doesn't just exhaust you, it gradually shapes your own thinking. You start to see the world through their lens almost without realizing it. Your own hope starts to feel naive. Your own ambition starts to feel foolish. Hope is not naive. Ambition is not foolish. But it's hard to hold on to that truth when you're regularly surrounded by someone who is committed to the opposite conclusion. The diminisher. This is the subtlest and perhaps most damaging type. The diminisher doesn't necessarily criticize you directly. They're just never quite as excited about your good news as you hoped. They find the flaw in your plan. They remember your failures better than your successes. They offer just being realistic as a cover for what is actually a chronic pattern of deflating your enthusiasm. Sometimes diminishers don't even know they're doing it. Sometimes it comes from their own unexpressed insecurity. If you succeed too much, if you grow too much, it highlights something about their own life that they're not comfortable looking at. But the impact is real, regardless of the intention. And you have to decide how much of your precious belief in yourself you're willing to risk on repeated exposure to someone who unconsciously chips away at it. The entitled taker. The relationship where the giving flows overwhelmingly in one direction, where you show up consistently with your time, your support, your emotional labor, your practical help, and what comes back is either very little or nothing at all. And when you need support, they're busy, or they redirect the conversation back to themselves, or they show up so poorly that it almost feels worse than if they hadn't shown up at all. This pattern can persist for years because of history, because you remember when this person was different, or when the relationship was more balanced, or because you've been given for so long that leaving feels like an admission that all that giving was wasted. It wasn't wasted. What you gave came from your values, your capacity for care, your generosity of spirit. Those things belong to you regardless of whether this person deserved them. But you don't have to keep giving to someone who has demonstrated repeatedly and clearly that they are not in this relationship to give anything back. The art of creating distance without drama. Okay, so you've identified that a relationship is draining you. You've recognized the pattern. You know honestly and clearly that this connection is costing more than it's giving. Now what? Most people imagine that creating distance means a confrontation, a difficult conversation, a formal ending, and sometimes, occasionally, that is the right thing. Sometimes a relationship has been so damaging, so clear in its toxicity, that a direct and honest conversation is necessary for your own integrity and for the other person's understanding. But most of the time, it doesn't have to be that dramatic. Here's the thing about distance. It can be created gradually, naturally, without announcement. You simply become less available. You respond to messages more slowly. You accept fewer invitations. When you do spend time together, you keep it shorter, lighter, less emotionally intimate. You don't owe anyone a speech about why you're pulling back. You don't have to explain yourself, justify your choices, or get their permission to protect your own energy. You can love someone and still choose not to give them unlimited access to your time and attention. You can wish someone well and still decide that seeing them every week is too much. You can hold someone in genuine affection and still recognize that the relationship, in its current form, is not where you need to invest yourself right now. And as you create that distance, as you free up the time and energy that was going into draining connections, notice what becomes possible. Notice the space that opens up. Notice the quiet that arrives when you're not constantly managing someone else's chaos or recovering from someone else's negativity. That space is not emptiness. That space is potential. Who deserves a place in your life? This conversation isn't only about who to move away from. It's equally, maybe more importantly, about who to move toward. Because here's the flip side of everything we've been talking about. When you free up the energy you were spending on the wrong people, you suddenly have so much more capacity to invest in the right ones. So who are the right ones? They're the people who make you feel more like yourself, not a performance of yourself, not a smaller version of yourself, but genuinely, fully yourself. The people around whom you don't have to edit your ambition or hide your enthusiasm or manage their reaction to your growth. They're the people who tell you the truth, not to diminish you, but because they respect you enough to be honest. Who point out your blind spots with care, who celebrate your wins without jealousy and sit with your losses without judgment. They're the people who are growing themselves, not perfectly. Nobody is growing perfectly, but genuinely, honestly trying. Because when you're around people who are in motion, who are committed to their own development, it normalizes the discomfort of growth. It makes the hard work feel less lonely. They're the people who, after you've spent time with them, leave you feeling like you can do this, like the things you're trying to build are worth building, like you're not crazy for caring about becoming a better version of yourself. These people exist, and if you don't have many of them in your life right now, that's not a permanent condition. It's a direction. Where do you find them? Wherever people who are doing the things you want to do tend to gather, in classes, in communities, built around shared values, in workplaces that attract people with genuine drive, in online spaces organized around growth rather than entertainment. You don't have to have a perfect social circle right now. You just need to start moving toward the kind of people you want to become. A question worth sitting with. Before we move to the final part of this journey, I want to leave you with something to carry. Think about the 5 people you spend the most time with. Not the people you love most necessarily, but the people who have the most actual access to your time, your energy, your attention. For each of them, ask honestly, when I leave this person's presence, am I generally moving toward the life I want to build or away from it? You don't have to make any dramatic decisions today. You don't have to end anything, announce anything, or change anything immediately. Just sit with the honest answer. Because clarity about who you're spending your life with is one of the most important kinds of clarity you can have. And you deserve to make that choice consciously, not by default, not by obligation, not by the inertia of history, but with full awareness of what your time and energy are worth. And here's what I know to be true. Your energy is worth protecting. Your growth is worth prioritizing. Your future is worth choosing, even when choosing it means letting go of parts of your past. The people who are meant to walk with you into the next chapter of your life, they'll still be there, or new ones will arrive, drawn to the person you're becoming. But first, you have to become that person, and that requires protecting the energy to do so. Here's a question that most people never think to ask when their life falls apart. Not, how do I fix this situation? Not, how do I get back to where I was? But this one, who do I need to become? That question changes everything. Because here's the hard truth that nobody wants to hear when they're in the middle of rebuilding, when they're exhausted and disoriented and just trying to get their footing back. You cannot build a fundamentally different life with the same identity that created the old one. You can rearrange the circumstances. You can change the job, the city, the relationship, the routine. You can start over in every external way possible. But if the person walking into that new life is carrying the same self-concept, the same limiting beliefs, the same unconscious patterns as the person who walked out of the old one, the new life will eventually start to look a lot like the old one. Because the common denominator in every version of your life is you. This is not an accusation. This is not a judgment. This is not a way of saying that everything that went wrong was your fault or that your suffering was self-inflicted. This is an invitation to go deeper than circumstances, to stop asking how to fix what's outside you and start asking how to transform what's inside you, to recognize that the most powerful work of rebuilding doesn't happen in your bank account or your LinkedIn profile or your zip code. It happens in your identity. And that work, as uncomfortable and as slow and as unglamorous as it often is the only work that creates lasting change. Everything else is rearranging furniture in a house that needs a new foundation. What identity actually is and why most people get it wrong. Let's get precise about something because the word identity gets thrown around constantly without much clarity about what it actually means. And that imprecision costs people enormously when they're trying to change. Your identity is not your personality. It's not your job title. It's not your nationality, your family role, your relationship status, or the city you live in. Those things are circumstantial. They can change overnight. They have nothing to do with the deepest layer of who you are. Your identity is the story you tell yourself about who you are. More specifically, it's the collection of beliefs, most of them operating completely below the level of conscious awareness, that define what you're capable of, what you deserve, what's possible for someone like you, and how you're supposed to behave in any given situation. These beliefs were not chosen. They were absorbed. They came from your parents' voices when you were too young to evaluate them critically. They came from early experiences that your developing brain turned into permanent conclusions. They came from the feedback you received from teachers, peers, coaches, and partners. Feedback that your mind integrated into a running narrative about who you fundamentally are. They've been reinforced so many times over so many years through so many experiences that they don't feel like beliefs anymore. They feel like facts. I'm not the kind of person who finishes things. I'm naturally anxious. That's just who I am. I'm not disciplined enough for that. I always self-sabotage when things are going well. People from where I come from don't get to have lives like that. I've never been lucky. I'm just not smart in that way. These statements feel like descriptions of reality, like neutral observations about a fixed truth. They're not. They're stories. Stories that were written by experiences you had before you were equipped to interpret them clearly. Stories that were reinforced by a mind doing its best to make sense of a complicated world. Stories that, in many cases, once served a protective function, helping you manage expectations, avoid disappointment, stay safe within predictable limits. But stories, unlike facts, can be rewritten. The question is whether you're willing to do the work of rewriting them, because that work is real. It's uncomfortable. It requires you to look honestly at the narratives you've been living inside and ask whether they're actually true or just familiar. The architecture of a broken identity. When life falls apart in a significant way, when you lose something that was central to how you understood yourself, something happens that goes much deeper than circumstance. Your identity fractures. Not always all at once. Sometimes it's a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone. Sometimes it's sudden, a phone call, a diagnosis, a decision that arrives and removes the ground from beneath your feet. But however it happens, the result is the same. The story you were telling about yourself, the one that gave your life coherence and direction and meaning, no longer holds. And when that story breaks, something deeply frightening happens. You don't know who you are anymore, not in a philosophical, abstract way, in a visceral, daily, practical way. You wake up in the morning, and for a moment, before the reality of your situation reasserts itself, you reach for the old story, the old context, the old version of yourself that made sense within the life you had. And then it's gone, and you're left holding the question that may be the most disorienting question a human being can face. If I'm not who I thought I was, then who am I? Most people respond to this question by trying to reconstruct the old identity as quickly as possible, by rushing back to familiar roles, familiar relationships, familiar patterns of behavior, even when those patterns were part of what created the problem in the first place. Because the old identity, however imperfect, was at least known, and the known, however painful, feels safer than the unknown. But here's what that rush to reconstruct misses. The fracture is not only a loss, it is also an opening. When the old story breaks, there is a moment, often brief, often terrifying, when you have access to something you didn't have before, a kind of radical freedom. The freedom to choose more deliberately than you've ever been able to before who you want to be, not who you defaulted to, not who circumstances shaped you into, not who other people's expectations defined you as, who you actually want to be. That moment doesn't last forever. The mind's tendency toward narrative coherence, toward story, will reassert itself. You will rebuild an identity. The question is whether you rebuild it consciously or unconsciously, whether you choose it or whether you simply fall back into the patterns of least resistance. This is your window. Right now, in whatever disruption or loss or transition you're navigating, this is the moment to choose, the gap between who you are and who you need to become. There's a concept in psychology called the actual self versus the ideal self, the distance between who you currently are and who you believe you could or should be. In periods of stability, this gap is manageable. You know who you are, you have a general sense of where you're headed, and the distance between where you are and where you want to be feels traversable, even if it's uncomfortable. But after a major life disruption, that gap can feel enormous, overwhelming, like you're standing at the base of a mountain looking up at a summit hidden in clouds with no path visible and no equipment you recognize. The gap feels enormous for a few different reasons. First, because loss often strips away the scaffolding that was holding your sense of self together. The relationship, the career, the routine, the social circle, the place. All of these things were providing external structure for your identity. When they go, the identity they were supporting goes with them, and what's left can feel formless and unstable in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. Second, because the version of yourself you need to become in order to build the life you want is genuinely different from who you currently are. Not in terms of fundamental worth or value. You are enough. You have always been enough. But in terms of habits, patterns, beliefs, and behaviors, real growth requires real change. And real change is genuinely hard. Third, because the middle, the space between who you were and who you're becoming, is the most disorienting place to live. You've left the old shore, but you can't yet see the new one. You're in open water. And open water is terrifying, even when the direction you're swimming is exactly right. Dr. William Bridges, who spent decades studying life transitions, called this space the neutral zone. He described it as the most psychologically challenging phase of any transition. Not the ending, when things are falling apart, and not the new beginning, when things are coming together, but the in-between, the liminal space where you're neither what you were nor yet what you're becoming. Most people want to escape the neutral zone as quickly as possible. They rush toward any available identity, any role, any relationship, any story that will give them solid ground to stand on again. And in doing so, they often miss the most important work of their lives. Because the neutral zone, as uncomfortable as it is where real transformation happens. It's where the old patterns get examined rather than simply reconstructed. It's where you get to ask the questions that ordinary life doesn't give you time for. It's where identity gets rebuilt from the foundation rather than just patched on the surface. Stay in it a little longer than feels comfortable. Not forever, but long enough to do the work it's asking you to do. The identity behavior loop and why you've been doing it backwards. Here's something that will fundamentally change the way you think about personal change. Because most people approach identity transformation completely backwards. And that backwards approach is why most attempts at personal change eventually fail. The conventional model of change goes like this. First, I'll decide I want to change. Then I'll get motivated. Then, when I feel ready and inspired, I'll take action. The action will produce results. The results will build confidence. And eventually, I'll become a different person. This model is seductive because it feels logical. It also almost never works. Here's why. Motivation is not a reliable starting point. It's a feeling, and feelings are contextual, temporary, and deeply influenced by factors outside your control. You feel motivated after a powerful conversation, a compelling book, a particularly difficult moment that clarified what matters. You feel unmotivated when you're tired, when things aren't working, when the gap between where you are and where you want to be feels too wide. If you wait for motivation to take action, you'll spend most of your life waiting, and in the waiting, nothing changes. The model that actually works runs in the opposite direction. You choose who you want to become. You begin acting, immediately, imperfectly, without waiting to feel ready, in ways that are consistent with that chosen identity. The small actions generate evidence. The evidence updates your self-concept. The updated self-concept makes the next action slightly easier. And gradually, over time, the identity shifts. James Clear, in his landmark work on habits and behavior change, describes this as identity-based habits. The idea is that the most durable changes in behavior come not from setting goals, which are outcome-focused, but from shifting identity, which is process-focused. The difference looks like this. Goal-based. I want to run a marathon. Identity-based. I am someone who moves their body and respects its capabilities. Goal-based. I want to read more books this year. Identity-based. I am someone who invests in their own understanding of the world. Goal-based. I want to be less anxious. Identity-based. I am someone who practices meeting uncertainty with curiosity rather than fear. Goals can be achieved or failed. Identity is a direction, and direction, sustained over time, covers far more ground than any single destination. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you believe yourself to be. A single vote doesn't decide an election, but enough votes, cast consistently enough over a long enough period of time, that changes the outcome. You don't have to feel like the person you're becoming in order to start acting like them. You just have to start. The feeling follows the action, not the other way around. The 6 core elements of identity rebuilding. Let me walk you through the specific elements that make up genuine identity transformation, not as abstract concepts, but as practical, applicable work you can actually do. Element 1. Define the person you're becoming with radical specificity. Vague intentions produce vague results. I want to be a better person, or I want to be more successful, are not identity statements. They're wishes, and wishes don't change behavior because they don't give you enough information to act on. Real identity work requires you to get uncomfortably specific about who you are becoming, not who you admire from a distance, not who you think you should be based on other people's expectations. Who you, knowing yourself, knowing your values, knowing what you've been through and what it's taught you, genuinely want to become. Sit with this question seriously. What does this person actually do? How do they move through the world? How do they handle difficulty? What are their non-negotiables? The things they simply don't compromise on, not out of rigidity, but out of clarity about what matters. What do they prioritize? What do they say no to so they can say yes to what counts? Write this person into existence, in present tense, in first person, as if you are describing someone who already exists and whose path you are actively walking. I am someone who shows up for the commitments I make to myself with the same reliability I bring to commitments I make to others. I am someone who processes difficulty without being defined by it. I am someone who invests in my own growth because I've decided that who I'm becoming matters more than who I've been. I am someone who speaks honestly, even when dishonesty would be easier. I am someone who chooses discomfort over stagnation. I am someone who builds things that outlast my moods. That level of specificity, that level of honesty, that level of intentionality. Write your person into existence, and then, every single day, ask yourself, did I act like that person today? Not perfectly, not completely, but directionally. Did you move toward them or away from them? That daily question is one of the most powerful identity tools available to you. Element 2. Find the smallest possible proof points and take them seriously. Here's where most people go wrong in identity work. They set enormous goals, completely overhaul their health, build a business from scratch, transform their relationships, and when the gap between who they currently are and who they're trying to become becomes apparent, the overwhelm arrives. And overwhelm leads to paralysis. And paralysis looks, from the inside, like proof that change isn't possible for you. It's not proof of that. It's just the natural response to trying to change too much too fast. The goal isn't to change everything overnight. The goal is to generate evidence, small, consistent, accumulating evidence that a new identity is real. What is the smallest possible version of who you're becoming that you can express today? If the person you're becoming is someone who finishes what they start, finish one small thing today, not a major project, a task you've been putting off, an email you've been avoiding, one thing from start to completion. If the person you're becoming is someone who takes their health seriously, take a 20-minute walk, choose water instead of the soda, go to sleep 30 minutes earlier. If the person you're becoming is someone who invests in their mind, read 10 pages, listen to something that challenges your thinking, spend 15 minutes with an idea that's unfamiliar to you. These things sound almost insultingly small. That's exactly why they work. Because small things, done consistently, create something that grand gestures never can, a track record. And a track record is identity made visible. It's your beliefs about yourself updating in real time, based on direct evidence from your own behavior. Every time you do what you said you were going to do, even in a small way, even imperfectly, you are casting a vote for the person you're becoming. And over time, those votes accumulate into something that starts to feel, from the inside, like who you actually are. Element 3. Conduct an honest audit of your self-narrative. This is perhaps the most important and least comfortable element of identity work, but it is absolutely necessary. Set aside real time, not 5 minutes between tasks, but genuine, unhurried time, to examine the stories you tell about yourself, the ones you say out loud, in conversations with others, the ones you tell silently, in the constant internal monologue that runs beneath your daily life. Listen specifically for the phrases that define your limits, the constructions that locate you within a fixed set of possibilities. I'm not good at, I've never been able to, that's just the way I am. I've tried that before. And people like me don't. Every one of those phrases is a story, and every story is a choice, whether or not you made it consciously. Now comes the difficult question. Is this story actually true? Not, has this been my experience so far? Because yes, it probably has been. Your experience and your story are in a feedback loop. The story shapes your behavior. Your behavior generates experiences that confirm the story, and the story gets reinforced. That's what stories do. The question is whether this story is a permanent, fixed, unchangeable fact about who you are, or whether it's a pattern, a habit of interpretation that was established at some point in your past and has been running on autopilot ever since. Almost always, it's the latter. The belief that you're not disciplined is not a fact. It's a conclusion drawn from a pattern of behavior that itself arose from an identity that told you discipline wasn't something you were capable of. The belief that you're unlucky is not a fact. It's a narrative that has been selectively collecting evidence in its own favor, noticing the failures and the disappointments while discounting the times things went right. The belief that you can't sustain change is not a fact. It's the echo of previous attempts that were made without the understanding of identity work that you now have access to. Hold your stories more loosely. Start examining them from the outside rather than living in them from the inside. Ask, what would be possible if this story wasn't true? And then, without waiting for certainty, without waiting for proof, start acting in ways that are consistent with that possibility. The proof will come, but it comes after the action, not before. Element 4. Redesign your environment for the person you're becoming. Your environment is one of the most powerful and most underestimated forces shaping your identity, and most people have never deliberately designed it. The physical spaces you occupy, the objects that surround you, the media you consume, the sounds and images that fill your hours, the routes you walk, the people whose presence you absorb. All of these are constantly sending signals to your brain about who you are and how you live. And your brain integrates those signals continuously, shaping your self-concept in response. This is not metaphor, it's neuroscience. Your environment is doing identity work on you whether you participate in the process or not. The question is whether it's doing the identity work you actually want done. Think about your physical space. What does it say about who you are? What does it communicate about your values, your priorities, your relationship with your own life? If you want to become someone who thinks clearly and creates consistently, does your workspace support focus, or does it invite distraction? Is it organized in a way that makes good work easy, or is it cluttered in a way that makes everything feel harder than it needs to be? If you want to become someone who reads widely and thinks deeply, are books visible and accessible in your home, on your nightstand, on your desk, somewhere you'll encounter them naturally throughout your day? Or are they somewhere out of sight while your phone lives permanently at arm's reach? If you want to become someone who takes their physical well-being seriously, does your kitchen make it easier to eat in ways that support you, or does it default to whatever requires least effort? Is your workout gear somewhere that makes it easy to use, or buried somewhere that makes starting feel like an ordeal? Small environmental shifts produce outsized behavioral effects, not because they change your motivation or they don't, but because they change the friction associated with different choices. They make the right choices slightly easier and the wrong choices slightly harder. And in the accumulated weight of daily decisions, slightly easier and slightly harder make an enormous difference. Design your environment for the person you're becoming. Let your spaces tell the story of who you're choosing to be. Element 5. Curate your inputs with intention. What you consistently consume shapes who you become. This is not a new idea, but most people apply it only to the obvious categories: junk food, alcohol, explicit negativity, while completely ignoring the more subtle and arguably more influential category of mental and emotional inputs. Everything you read, watch, listen to, and engage with is input. Every conversation you participate in is input. Every social media feed you scroll is input. Every podcast, every news source, every piece of content that passes through your attention is depositing something into the ongoing construction of your beliefs, your self-concept, and your sense of what's possible. Most people are completely passive about this. They consume whatever is easiest to access, whatever the algorithm surfaces, whatever everyone around them is engaging with. And then they wonder why their thinking feels narrow, why their sense of possibility feels constrained, why they keep bumping up against the same internal limitations. Your inputs are not neutral. They are actively shaping you. The question is whether you're shaping them or they're shaping you. Stop making deliberate choices about what you let in. Seek out the stories of people who have navigated what you're navigating and come out the other side. Not to compare yourself to them. Comparison is almost always a trap. But to normalize possibility. To show your brain, through repeated exposure, that the thing you're trying to do is real. That people like you, facing what you're facing, have found their way through. Follow the thinkers who challenge your current limitations. Read the books that expand your sense of what's possible. Listen to the conversations that model the kind of thinking you want to develop. And be honest, genuinely, ruthlessly honest about the inputs that are not serving you, the accounts that make you feel worse about yourself every time you engage with them, the content that activates your worst tendencies rather than your best ones, the media environments that leave you feeling more anxious, more cynical, and more helpless than before you engaged with them. You don't have to build a bubble. You don't have to curate your world into an echo chamber of relentless positivity. But you do have to be honest about what your consistent diet of information and story and imagery is doing to your sense of yourself and your possibilities. Feed the identity you're building and starve the one you're leaving behind. Element 6. Develop radical patience with the process. This is the element that separates the people who actually transform from the people who tried. Identity change is slow, not because you're doing it wrong, not because you don't want it badly enough, but because identity is a deep structure, and deep structures change gradually, through accumulation, through consistency, through the patient repetition of new choices over a long enough period of time that they stop feeling new and start feeling like who you actually are. You will not feel like a different person after a week of new habits. You probably won't feel dramatically different after a month. The change is real. It's happening. It's accumulating. It's building the foundation of something genuinely new. But it's happening below the surface in ways that aren't yet visible from the outside or even often from the inside. This is the danger zone, the period where the work is real, but the results aren't visible, where you're doing everything right and it doesn't feel like anything is changing, where the gap between the effort you're putting in and the evidence you can see feels demoralizing. This is exactly where most people quit. And here's what makes it particularly cruel. Right at the moment they quit, they often interpret their decision to quit as evidence of the very identity story they were trying to change. See? I knew I couldn't sustain this. I knew I'd give up eventually. This just proves that I'm not the kind of person who can change. But that's not what it proves. It proves that identity change is hard and that the window between consistent effort and visible results is genuinely uncomfortable. That's all it proves. The response to that window is not to work harder. It's not to force more motivation or manufacture more willpower. It's to get better at tolerating the discomfort of growth without interpreting it as failure. Development psychologist Carol Dweck, whose research on mindset has influenced decades of thinking about human potential, found that the single most important factor in whether people persist through difficulty is not their talent, their resources, or their circumstances. It's their relationship with struggle itself. People who understand that struggle is a normal and necessary part of growth, not an indication that something is wrong, persist longer, learn more, and ultimately achieve more than people with equivalent talent who interpret struggle as evidence of inadequacy. Struggle is not evidence that you're failing. It's evidence that you're growing. And growing, by definition, means you're not yet where you're going. That's the point. Be patient with yourself. Be honest with yourself. And keep going. When the old identity fights back, I want to prepare you for something that's going to happen. Not might happen, but will happen as you do this work. There will be moments when the old identity fights back. Not metaphorically, practically, concretely. You'll be making real progress, acting consistently with the person you're becoming, building the track record, feeling the subtle but real shift in how you move through your days. And then something will happen. Maybe a setback, maybe a failure, maybe just a hard day when you're depleted and your defenses are low. And in that moment, the old story will return with surprising force. Who do you think you are? You've been here before. You know how this ends. You're not actually different. You're just in a temporary phase of feeling motivated. The real you is still the same person you've always been. This is not weakness. This is not evidence that the work isn't real. This is a predictable, almost inevitable response of a deeply entrenched pattern being disrupted. Old neural pathways don't simply disappear when you stop using them. They remain, waiting, ready to reassert themselves when circumstances make them feel relevant again. The response to this moment is not to argue with the old story. Argument rarely works because the old story has years of evidence on its side and can hold its own in a debate. The response is something simpler and more powerful: acknowledgement and redirection. I hear that. I know that story, and I'm choosing a different one. Not with drama, not with force, just the quiet, firm, repeated choice to keep going, to cast one more vote for the person you're becoming, to show up, however imperfectly, for the next small thing. The old identity loses power through disuse, not through defeat. Every time you choose the new story over the old one, even in a moment when the old one feels more true, you are withdrawing energy from the pattern you're leaving and investing it in the pattern you're building. This is how it works, not in one dramatic moment of transformation, in the patient, consistent accumulation of redirections. The role of pain in identity rebuilding. There's something that needs to be said about the relationship between pain and identity, something that most conversations about personal growth skip over because it's uncomfortable. Your pain is not an obstacle to your identity rebuilding. It is material for it. Every genuinely difficult thing you have been through has taught you something that cannot be learned any other way. Not from books, not from seminars, not from the most eloquent motivational content in the world. It was taught through direct experience, through the specific, personal, irreducible reality of what it felt like to go through what you went through, that knowledge is yours. And it is worth more than most people realize. The person who has survived a significant loss and done the honest work of understanding what it meant knows something about impermanence that someone who hasn't been through that loss can only understand conceptually. The person who has built something and watched it fail and chosen to build again understands something about resilience that no amount of reading about resilience can provide. The person who has been betrayed by someone they trusted and found their way to a life without, that person knows something about their own inner resources that they couldn't have known before the betrayal. Pain, processed honestly, becomes wisdom, and wisdom, genuine, hard-won, experiential wisdom, is one of the most powerful foundations for a rebuilt identity. This doesn't mean the pain was good. It doesn't mean you deserved it or that it was necessary in some cosmic sense. It means that since it happened, since you couldn't prevent it and can't undo it, the question is what you choose to do with it. You can let it become weight, something you carry, that bends you, that makes everything harder. Or you can let it become foundation, something you build on, something that precisely because it was difficult and because you found your way through it, makes the structure of who you are more solid than it was before. The choice between those two possibilities is real, and it is yours. Rebuilding identity after different kinds of loss. Identity rebuilding doesn't look exactly the same after every kind of loss. Let me speak directly to a few of the most common ones, because the specific work required varies depending on what you've been through. After the end of a significant relationship, when a relationship that was central to your life ends, marriage, long-term partnership, a friendship that was more like family, a significant part of your identity goes with it. Not because you defined yourself entirely through the other person, but because who you were in relationship to them was a real part of who you were. The identity work here involves something that's harder than it sounds, rediscovering who you are as a person independent of that relationship. What do you actually enjoy? Not what you enjoyed together, not the compromises of two lives merged, but what lights you up when you're entirely accountable only to yourself. What kind of life do you want to build, with no one else's preferences to consider? What values are genuinely yours, rather than values you adopted because they made the relationship work? These questions can feel overwhelming in the early days of a loss this significant. That's okay. You don't have to answer all of them immediately. You just have to start moving toward them. Start spending time with yourself in ways that feel genuine rather than just filling space. Start exploring the edges of your own preferences. Start building a life that gradually starts to feel like it belongs to you. After a career loss or professional failure, in American culture specifically, and in most Western cultures, the connection between professional identity and personal identity is extraordinarily strong. What we do is deeply tied to who we believe we are, and when what we do goes away, the identity crisis that follows can be profound. The work here involves decoupling your worth from your productivity. This is genuinely difficult in a culture that constantly reinforces the message that your value is determined by your output. But It is essential. Who are you when you're not achieving? What makes you worth knowing when you're not accomplishing anything impressive? What values do you hold that exist completely independently of your professional role? These questions are not meant to make you comfortable with mediocrity or to suppress your ambition. They're meant to establish a foundation of identity that your professional life can be built on top of, rather than a foundation that collapses whenever your professional life does. After a health crisis or loss of physical capability, when your body changes significantly through illness, injury, or the simple passage of time, the identity disruption can be particularly acute because the body is the most intimate level of selfhood. It's where we live. And when it changes in ways we didn't choose, it can feel like a loss of self that goes deeper than any circumstance. The work here involves finding the continuity beneath the physical change, the aspects of who you are that exist independent of what your body can or cannot do. Your humor, your curiosity, your relationships, your values, your perspective, your history, your capacity for love and contribution, none of these are located in your physical capability. They persist through physical change. This doesn't minimize what you've lost. It doesn't pretend the loss of physical capacity isn't real and significant. It simply asserts, truthfully, that it is not the whole of you. After geographical or cultural displacement, when you leave a place, whether by choice or by necessity, a part of your identity leaves with you. The community, the familiar streets, the language, the cultural context, the sense of belonging to a particular place, all of this was holding part of your identity in place. And its loss, even when the move was chosen, can be disorienting in ways that take time to name. The work here involves building a portable identity, an identity that doesn't depend on any specific place to be real. Not that place doesn't matter, it does, and it's okay to grieve its loss, but that the core of who you are and the life you're building can take root in new soil. Bringing it all together. We've covered a lot of ground in this final part of the journey. Let me bring it home and bring together everything we've explored across all 4 parts of this work. You began by accepting what's true, by choosing to stop fighting the reality of what has changed and to start directing your energy toward what you can build. That acceptance wasn't defeat. It was the foundation, the clear ground on which everything else gets built. You learned to change the question from why me, which looks backward, which keeps you in the story of what was done to you, to what now, which looks forward, which positions you as the author rather than the subject of your own story. That shift is simple, and it is everything. You learn to protect your energy, to make conscious, deliberate choices about who gets access to your time, your attention, your emotional resources. To recognize that your energy is not infinite, that it is precious, and that how you spend it is one of the most consequential choices you make every day. And now, here in this final part, you've arrived at the deepest work, the work of identity, of choosing with intention and clarity and patience who you are becoming, of understanding that lasting change doesn't come from fixing circumstances, but from transforming the person who walks into them. These 4 elements are not a linear sequence you complete and move past. They're a practice, a way of being in relationship with your own life that you return to again and again at every transition, every loss, every new beginning, because life will keep moving. New challenges will arrive, new losses, new disruptions, new moments when the ground shifts beneath your feet. And when they do, you will have something you didn't have before. A practice, a set of tools, a proven knowledge that you have been in hard places before and you have found your way through. And that knowledge, earned through direct experience, not borrowed from someone else's story, is the most durable foundation an identity can stand on. The person you're becoming is already real. I want to leave you with something true. Something I mean not as comfort or encouragement, but as a genuine statement of fact. The person you are becoming, the stronger, clearer, more grounded, more intentional version of you that all of this work is building toward, is not a fantasy. They are not some distant possibility that depends on everything going right from this point forward. They are already real. They exist in the choices you have made to keep going when stopping would have been easier. They exist in your refusal, imperfect and inconsistent and sometimes barely maintained, but real, to let what happened to you become the final word on who you are. They exist in the fact that you are still here, still reading, still caring enough about your own life to sit with these ideas and ask what they mean for you specifically. That person, the one who keeps showing up, who keeps trying, who has been through real loss and hasn't stopped, that person is not who you're trying to become. That person is already who you are. The work ahead is not about creating something that doesn't exist. It's about continuing to reveal something that has been there all along, underneath the grief, underneath the confusion, underneath the weight of everything that has happened. Your old life is over. That is true. That is painful. That deserves to be honored. But your new life, the one you are actively, consciously, courageously choosing to build, is not waiting for you in the future. It is beginning right now, in this moment, in the decision to accept what is so that you can build what could be, in the question, what now, spoken into the uncertainty, in the quiet, daily act of protecting your energy for the things that genuinely matter, in the patient, imperfect, persistent practice of becoming someone your future self will be grateful for. This is how you rebuild a life, not in one dramatic breakthrough, not in a single moment of clarity that makes everything simple, but in the accumulated weight of honest, intentional, forward-facing choices, made day after day by a person who has decided clearly and without reservation that they are worth the effort. You are worth the effort. You have always been worth the effort. Now, with full knowledge of what it costs and full knowledge of what it offers, go build something that matters.